Maria Rodriguez clutched her 4-year-old son Tommy's hand as they walked along the dusty highway outside of Amarillo, Texas. The scorching June sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, and their bare feet had already developed painful blisters from the rough pavement. At 7 months pregnant, every step felt like an eternity, but Maria knew she had no choice but to keep moving forward. The morning had started like any other in their cramped trailer park home. Maria had been preparing breakfast for Tommy when her landlord, Derek Morrison, appeared at her door with two burly men she'd never seen before. Derek was a cruel man who owned half the trailer park and treated his tenants like they were beneath him. He'd been harassing Maria for months, making inappropriate comments about her pregnancy and constantly threatening eviction, despite her rent being current. "Time's up, sweetheart," Derek had sneered, his gold teeth glinting in the morning light. "You've got 30 minutes to get your stuff and get out." Maria had stared at him in shock, her hands instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. She'd paid her rent just 3 days ago, and she had the receipt to prove it. But Derek had torn up the receipt right in front of her eyes, claiming she was 2 months behind. The eviction notice he'd presented was dated incorrectly, and Maria knew it was forged. She'd seen Derek do this to other single mothers in the park, especially those who couldn't afford lawyers to fight back. He targeted vulnerable women, knowing they had nowhere else to turn. Maria had tried to reason with him, showing him her bank statements and pleading for just one more day to figure out alternative housing. But Derek had just laughed, a cold, heartless sound that made Tommy cling to his mother's leg in fear. "Should have thought about that before you decided to have another kid you can't afford," he'd said, gesturing dismissively at her pregnant belly. His hired muscle had started loading their meager belongings into garbage bags, treating their few possessions like trash. Within an hour, Maria and Tommy found themselves standing on the side of the road with nothing but the clothes on their backs and $17 in Maria's pocket. Their shoes had been left behind in the chaos, and Derek had refused to let them go back for anything else. As they watched their trailer being sealed with a notice that warned against trespassing, Maria felt a crushing sense of despair wash over her. She'd worked double shifts at the diner for 3 years to afford that tiny space, and now it was gone. Her car had been repossessed the previous month when she'd chosen to pay rent instead of the car payment. With no family in Texas and no friends who could help, Maria made the only decision she could think of. She'd heard there was a women's shelter in the next town over, about 15 miles away. So they began walking, mother and child, with nothing but hope keeping them moving forward under the relentless Texas sun. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of them, shimmering with heat waves that made the distant horizon look like a mirage. Maria's feet were already raw from the hot pavement, and she could see that Tommy was struggling too, though he tried to be brave for his mother. Every few minutes, she would stop to rest, sitting on the dusty shoulder of the road while cars and trucks roared past them without slowing down. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Tommy said, his small voice barely audible over the sound of traffic. Maria looked down at her son, seeing the exhaustion in his young eyes, and felt her heart breaking. She'd given him the last of their water bottle an hour ago, and there was nothing left. The baby in her womb seemed to sense her distress, kicking and moving restlessly, adding to her discomfort. As they continued their journey, Maria couldn't help but think about how they'd ended up in this desperate situation. She'd moved to Texas 3 years ago after Tommy's father had abandoned them, seeking a fresh start and better opportunities. The job at Rosie's diner had seemed like a blessing at first. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady work, and the tips helped cover their basic needs. Everything had been going relatively well until she'd met James Martinez at the diner. He was a regular customer who seemed kind and interested in her life. They'd started dating, and for a few months, Maria had felt like maybe she'd found someone who could be a good father figure for Tommy. But when she told James about her pregnancy, he disappeared overnight, leaving her with nothing but broken promises and an unpaid phone bill. The pregnancy had made working at the diner more difficult. Her morning sickness was severe, and she'd been forced to miss several shifts. Her boss, understanding at first, had gradually become less sympathetic as her absences continued. When she'd finally been forced to reduce her hours due to doctor's orders, her income had dropped significantly. That's when Derek Morrison had started circling like a vulture, sensing her vulnerability. He'd begun making comments about her situation, suggesting there were other ways she could pay her rent. When Maria had firmly rejected his advances, he'd become vindictive, looking for any excuse to get rid of her. Now, as they walked mile after mile in the scorching heat, Maria wondered if she'd made the right choice in rejecting Derek's disgusting propositions. Maybe she should have swallowed her pride and dignity to keep a roof over Tommy's head. But deep down, she knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. She wouldn't sell her self-respect, not even for shelter. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Maria felt herself growing weaker with each step. Her pregnancy made the heat even more unbearable, and she could feel herself becoming dehydrated. Tommy was stumbling more frequently now, his little legs struggling to keep up with their desperate pace. Marcus Tex Thompson adjusted his worn cowboy hat as he guided his pickup truck along the familiar stretch of Highway 287. The 62-year-old rancher had been driving this route for over 30 years, hauling cattle feed and supplies between his ranch and the feed store in Amarillo. Today had been particularly productive. He'd managed to negotiate a better price for winter feed, which would help his struggling operation get through another year. Tex had been ranching his entire adult life, taking over the family business when his father had passed away in 1985. The Thompson Ranch had been in his family for 4 generations, but like many small operations, it had been fighting an uphill battle against corporate farming and fluctuating cattle prices. Despite the challenges, Tex loved the land and couldn't imagine doing anything else. As he drove along the sun-baked highway, Tex's thoughts were interrupted by an unusual sight in the distance. Through the heat shimmer rising from the asphalt, he could make out 2 figures walking along the shoulder of the road. As he got closer, his weathered hands tightened on the steering wheel when he realized it was a pregnant woman and a small child, both walking barefoot under the merciless Texas sun. Growing up in rural Texas, Tex had been raised with old-fashioned values about helping those in need. His mother, God rest her soul, had always taught him that you never pass by someone in trouble without offering assistance. "There but for the grace of God go I," she used to say, and those words had stuck with him throughout his life. Tex slowed his truck and pulled over about 50 feet ahead of the woman and child. As he stepped out of his air-conditioned cab, the wall of heat hit him like a physical blow. If he was feeling overwhelmed by the temperature, he couldn't imagine how difficult it must be for a pregnant woman and a small child to be walking in these conditions. "Ma'am," he called out, touching the brim of his hat respectfully as he approached. "Are you folks all right? Do you need some help?" He could see the wariness in the woman's eyes, the protective way she pulled her son closer to her side. In today's world, he understood why a vulnerable woman might be suspicious of a stranger offering help. "We're fine, thank you," Maria replied, though her voice was weak and strained. She'd been raised to be cautious of strangers, especially men who approached her when she was alone with Tommy. But something about this weathered cowboy seemed different from the men who had caused her so much trouble recently. Tex noticed the woman's obvious exhaustion, the way she was swaying slightly on her feet, and the concerning pallor of her skin despite the heat. The little boy was clinging to her hand, his face flushed red from the sun. "Ma'am, I don't mean to intrude, but it's near about 100 degrees out here, and you folks look like you've been walking for quite a while. Can I at least offer you some water and a ride to wherever you're headed?" Maria studied the man's face, searching for any sign of deception or ill intent. What she saw was genuine concern and kindness in his weathered features. His truck was old but well-maintained, and there was something about his demeanor that reminded her of her own grandfather, who had always been a pillar of strength and reliability in her childhood. "We're trying to get to Canyon," she said finally, naming the town where she'd heard there was a women's shelter. "But we don't have any money for a ride." The admission stung her pride, but she was beginning to realize that her stubbornness might put Tommy and her unborn child in danger. Tex nodded understandingly. "Canyon's about 10 miles from here, and it's going to be getting hotter as the day goes on. My name's Marcus Thompson, but folks call me Tex. I've got a ranch about 5 miles south of here, and I'd be happy to give you a ride wherever you need to go. No charge, of course." Maria hesitated for a moment longer, then felt Tommy's small hand squeeze hers weakly. When she looked down at her son, she saw that he was barely staying on his feet. The decision was made for her. She had to put her children's safety above her own fears. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My name is Maria Rodriguez, and this is my son Tommy. We would be very grateful for a ride." As Tex helped them into his air-conditioned truck, Maria felt the first glimmer of hope she'd experienced in months. Maybe there were still good people in the world after all. The cool air inside Tex's truck was like a blessing from heaven. Maria sank into the passenger seat with a grateful sigh, while Tommy curled up beside her, his small body finally able to relax. Tex had immediately handed them each a cold bottle of water from a cooler he kept in the truck, and Maria had to resist the urge to drain hers in one gulp. "Take your time with that water," Tex advised gently as he pulled back onto the highway. "Drink it slow, or you might get sick." His voice carried the wisdom of someone who had spent decades working under the brutal Texas sun. As they drove toward Canyon, he glanced sideways at his passengers, taking in their obvious distress and the fact that they were traveling without shoes or proper supplies. "If you don't mind me asking," Tex said carefully, "what brought you folks to be walking out here today? You look like you've been through quite an ordeal." There was no judgment in his voice, only genuine concern and a desire to help if he could. Maria was quiet for a long moment, unsure how much to share with this stranger who had shown them such unexpected kindness. But something about Tex's honest, weathered face encouraged her to open up. "We were evicted this morning," she said finally. "The landlord threw us out even though our rent was current. He destroyed our receipt and claimed we were behind on payments." Tex's jaw tightened as he listened to Maria's story. He'd heard similar tales before, unscrupulous landlords who preyed on vulnerable tenants, especially single mothers and immigrants who might not know their rights or have the resources to fight back. "That's not right," he said simply. "Not right at all." "I know it's not right," Maria replied, her voice carrying both exhaustion and frustration. "But what could I do? I'm 7 months pregnant, I have no family here, and I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight him. When he brought those men to force us out, I was scared for Tommy's safety." Tommy had been listening quietly to the conversation, his young mind trying to process everything that had happened. "The bad man said mean things to Mama," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the truck's engine. "He made her cry." Tex felt his anger growing as he thought about some coward intimidating a pregnant woman and her small child. In his world, there were few things lower than a man who would prey on those who couldn't defend themselves. "What's this landlord's name?" he asked, though he kept his voice calm so as not to alarm Tommy. "Derek Morrison," Maria said. "He owns Morrison Trailer Park outside of Amarillo. He's done this to other women too, I've heard, especially single mothers who can't fight back." She paused, then added quietly, "I should have seen it coming. He'd been inappropriate with me for months, making comments about my pregnancy, suggesting there were other ways I could pay rent. When I refused his advances, he started looking for excuses to get rid of me." The picture was becoming clearer to Tex, and he didn't like what he was seeing. Derek Morrison sounded like a predator who used his position of power to exploit vulnerable women. "Did you ever report his behavior to anyone?" he asked. Maria shook her head. "Who would believe me? He's a businessman in the community, and I'm just a single mother working at a diner. Besides, I needed that apartment. I couldn't risk making him angry until—" She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at their current situation. "Until he threw you out anyway," Tex finished grimly. They were entering the outskirts of Canyon now, and he could see the sign for the women's shelter ahead. But as they pulled into the parking lot, Tex made a decision that would change all their lives. As they sat in the parking lot of the Canyon Women's Shelter, Maria felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The building looked clean and well-maintained, with a small garden out front and children's toys visible through the windows. It wasn't the home she'd dreamed of providing for her children, but it was safe, and that was what mattered most right now. "Thank you so much for the ride," Maria said to Tex as she prepared to get out of the truck. "I don't know how we would have made it here without your help." She reached for the door handle, but Tex's voice stopped her. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what's your plan after this? I mean, long term." His question wasn't intrusive or judgmental, but rather seemed to come from genuine concern for their welfare. Maria was quiet for a moment, considering her options. "I'm hoping they can help me find temporary housing until the baby is born," she said finally. "Then I'll need to find a new job, somewhere that will hire someone with an infant. I had been working at Rosie's Diner in Amarillo, but the hours became too difficult with the pregnancy." Tex nodded thoughtfully. "Rosie's Diner, I know that place. Good food, fair prices. How long did you work there?" "About 3 years," Maria replied. "I started as a waitress, but Rosie taught me to cook some of the menu items too. I enjoyed the work, even though it was hard sometimes." There was a note of pride in her voice when she talked about her job, despite everything that had happened. "And you're a good cook?" Tex asked, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "I think so," Maria said modestly. "My grandmother taught me traditional Mexican recipes, and I learned American cooking at the diner. I can make just about anything if I have the right ingredients." Tommy had been listening to the conversation with the intense focus that children often display when adults are discussing important matters. "Mama makes the best enchiladas," he said proudly, "and her pancakes are better than the ones at the restaurant." Tex smiled at the boy's loyalty to his mother. "That's high praise from a young man," he said. "Tommy, do you like animals? Horses, cattle, that sort of thing?" Tommy's eyes lit up with interest. "I love horses. I've seen them on TV, but I've never been close to a real one. Are they as big as they look?" "Oh, they're big all right," Tex chuckled. "But most of them are gentle giants, especially if you know how to approach them properly." He paused, then turned back to Maria. "Ma'am, I hope you won't think I'm being too forward, but I've got a proposition for you." Maria looked at him warily. After her recent experiences with men making propositions, she had learned to be cautious. Tex seemed to sense her concern and quickly clarified. "It's a job offer, nothing more. I've been running my ranch by myself for the past 2 years since my wife passed away. The house is too big for just me, and I've been struggling to keep up with the cooking and household maintenance while managing the ranch work." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "I'm thinking maybe we could help each other out. I've got a guest house on the property. It's small but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a nice view of the pasture. If you were willing to help with cooking and some light housekeeping, I could provide housing and a fair wage. Nothing fancy, but it would be honest work and a safe place for you and Tommy to live." Maria stared at him in shock. After the morning's devastating events, this offer seemed almost too good to be true. "You would trust us in your home. You barely know us." "Ma'am, I've been judging character for 62 years, Tex said simply. "I can tell you're a good person who's fallen on hard times through no fault of your own. Besides, that little boy of yours has good manners and a protective instinct toward his mother. That tells me a lot about how he was raised." "But I'm 7 months pregnant," Maria protested. "I'll need time off when the baby comes, and I won't be able to work as hard as you might need." Tex waved off her concerns. "We'll figure that out when the time comes. Right now, you need a safe place to live, and I need help around the ranch. Seems like it might work out for both of us." As Maria considered the offer, she felt a cautious hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Could it really be this simple? Could one act of kindness from a stranger change their entire situation? She looked down at Tommy, who was watching her with trusting eyes, waiting for her decision. "If you're serious about this offer," she said slowly, "I would be very interested. But I want to be clear, I'm looking for honest work, nothing else. I won't be taken advantage of again." Tex nodded approvingly. "I respect that, ma'am. This would be a straight business arrangement. You'd have your own space, your own privacy, and if it doesn't work out for either of us, you'd be free to leave at any time. No strings attached." Maria felt tears of relief beginning to well up in her eyes. "In that case, Mr. Thompson, I accept your offer." The Thompson Ranch was exactly what Maria had imagined when she thought of a classic Texas spread. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with cattle and crossed by weathered wooden fences. The main house was a sprawling, single-story structure with a wraparound porch, and about 100 yards away sat a smaller building that Tex pointed out as the guest house. "That'll be your place," he said as they pulled up the gravel driveway. "It used to be where my ranch hands stayed back when I could afford to hire help. It's been empty for about 6 months now, but it's in good shape." Tommy pressed his face against the truck window, his eyes wide with wonder at the sight of horses grazing in a nearby pasture. "Mama, look at all the horses," he exclaimed, his earlier exhaustion forgotten in the excitement of this new adventure. "Those are some of my best mares," Tex said proudly. "And that big fellow over there is Thunder, my stallion. He's got a bit of an attitude, but he's a good horse once you earn his respect." As they got out of the truck, Thunder raised his head and nickered, as if welcoming the newcomers to his domain. The guest house was small but charming, with a cozy living room, a compact kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. Everything was clean and well maintained, with simple but comfortable furniture. The larger bedroom had a double bed and a dresser, while the smaller room contained a twin bed that would be perfect for Tommy. The previous tenant left some clothes and household items, Tex explained as he showed them around. "Feel free to use whatever you need. There's a washer and dryer in the utility room, and the kitchen is fully equipped." He opened the refrigerator, which was stocked with basic supplies. "I took the liberty of picking up some groceries yesterday, just in case." Maria was overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Mr. Thompson, I don't know how to thank you. This is more than I ever hoped for." "Call me Tex," he said simply. "And you don't need to thank me. Like I said, this arrangement benefits both of us. Now, why don't you folks get settled in and rest for a bit? You've had a long day." As Tex headed back to the main house, Maria and Tommy explored their new home. The guest house felt like a palace compared to the cramped trailer they'd been evicted from that morning. Tommy claimed the smaller bedroom, delighting in having his own space, while Maria sat on the bed in the master bedroom and allowed herself to cry tears of relief. For the first time in months, she felt safe. The baby in her womb seemed to sense her emotional state and settled down, as if it too approved of their new surroundings. Through the bedroom window, she could see the pasture where the horses grazed peacefully, and beyond that, the endless Texas sky painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. That evening, Maria insisted on cooking dinner for Tex as a small gesture of gratitude. Using the supplies he'd provided, she prepared a simple but hearty meal of chicken enchiladas, Spanish rice, and refried beans. When she called him over to the guest house, he arrived with a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from the field. "These are for you," he said, handing her the flowers with a shy smile. "My wife always said a table looked better with flowers on it." The gesture was so sweet and unexpected that Maria felt tears prick her eyes again. Over dinner, they discussed the practical aspects of their arrangement. Maria would be responsible for cooking 2 meals a day, doing light cleaning in the main house, and helping with administrative tasks like managing invoices and correspondence. In return, she would receive free housing, utilities, and a weekly salary that was more than she'd been making at the diner. "I want to be clear about something," Tex said as they finished eating. "This is your home now for as long as you want it to be. You're not a servant or an employee who can be dismissed on a whim. We're partners in making this ranch work." That night, as Maria tucked Tommy into his new bed, her son looked up at her with eyes full of wonder. "Mama, is this really our home now?" "Yes, sweetheart," she said, kissing his forehead. "This is our home." The next morning, Maria woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. For a moment, she was disoriented, forgetting where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she realized she was waking up in her own bed in her own home for the first time in months. Tommy was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table and staring out the window at the horses. "Mama, when can I meet the horses?" he asked as soon as he saw her. "After breakfast," she promised. "But first, I need to start earning our keep by cooking for Mr. Tex." She began preparing a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, hash browns, and fresh biscuits, humming to herself as she worked. It felt good to be cooking in her own kitchen again, even if it was small. When she carried the meal over to the main house, she found Tex already up and dressed in his work clothes. "Ma'am, you didn't need to go to all this trouble," he said, but his eyes lit up at the sight of the food. "Though I have to admit, it's been a long time since I've had a proper home-cooked breakfast." "It's no trouble at all," Maria replied. "I enjoy cooking and you've been so kind to us. It's the least I can do." As they ate breakfast together, Tex outlined his daily routine and explained how Maria could help make the ranch run more efficiently. "I usually start work before dawn, checking on the cattle and horses. Then I come in for breakfast around 7, work until noon, break for lunch, and then work until dinner time. Having someone to prepare meals and handle the household tasks would free up a lot of time for me to focus on the ranch work." After breakfast, Tex made good on his promise to introduce Tommy to the horses. The boy was initially nervous around the large animals, but Tex's patient guidance soon had him confidently feeding carrots to Thunder and the mares. Maria watched from the fence, marveling at how quickly her son had adapted to this new environment. "He's a natural," Tex commented, watching Tommy Gentle stroke Thunder's neck. "Some folks are just born with a way with animals. I think your boy might be one of them." As the days passed, Maria and Tommy settled into their new routine. Maria found that she genuinely enjoyed the work, and Tex was an easy employer who treated her with respect and kindness. The ranch felt like a real home, something she hadn't experienced since her childhood. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't forget about Derek Morrison and the injustice of what he'd done to them. She found herself wondering if he was continuing to prey on other vulnerable women, and the thought made her angry. One evening, as she was cleaning up after dinner, she made a decision that would change everything. "Tex," she said, finding him on the porch where he often sat in the evenings, "I need to ask you something. You mentioned that you didn't think what Derek Morrison did to us was right. Were you just being polite, or did you really mean it?" Tex looked up from the ranch ledger he'd been reviewing. "Ma'am, I don't say things I don't mean. What he did to you was wrong, and I suspect it wasn't the first time he's pulled something like that." Maria took a deep breath. "Then I want to do something about it. I want to make sure he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt us." Tex closed the ledger and studied her face in the dim porch light. "What did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet," Maria admitted. "But I have an idea that might work. I just need to know if you'll help me." Tex was quiet for a long moment, considering her request. Finally, he nodded. "Ma'am, if you're thinking about taking on Derek Morrison, you'll need to be smart about it. Men like him have power and connections. But if you're determined to see justice done, then you'll have my support." Maria felt a surge of determination. Derek Morrison had thought he could destroy her life without consequences, but he'd underestimated her resilience and her ability to fight back. With Tex's help, she was going to make sure he learned that actions had consequences. Over the next few days, Maria began developing her plan. She started by doing research on Derek Morrison and his business practices, using the internet at the local library when she went into town for supplies. What she discovered made her even more determined to stop him. Derek Morrison owned not just the trailer park where she'd lived, but several other low-income housing properties around Amarillo. Online reviews and complaint forums painted a picture of a man who consistently exploited his tenants, particularly single mothers and elderly residents who couldn't afford legal representation. There were multiple reports of sudden evictions, destroyed receipts, and demands for sexual favors in exchange for housing. Several women had tried to file complaints with local authorities, but Morrison apparently had connections that helped him avoid serious consequences. "He's been doing this for years," Maria explained to Tex as they sat in the guest house kitchen, surrounded by printed articles and complaint forms. "Look at this. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 80-year-old widow, evicted after 30 years of on-time rent payments. Sandra Williams, a single mother of 3, thrown out 2 days before Christmas. The pattern is always the same. Tex studied the documents with growing anger. This man is a predator, plain and simple. The question is, how do we stop him without putting you and Tommy at risk? Maria had been thinking about that very question. I have an idea, but it's going to require some acting on my part. Are you familiar with the concept of a sting operation? You mean like what the police do to catch criminals? Tex asked, his eyebrows rising. Exactly, Maria said. Derek Morrison thinks he destroyed me. He has no idea that I landed on my feet, that I'm in a safe place with people who care about me. What if we use that to our advantage? She outlined her plan to Tex, who listened with growing admiration for her courage and cleverness. The idea was risky, but it might just work. If they could gather enough evidence of Morrison's illegal activities, they could present it to the authorities and the media, making it impossible for him to continue his predatory behavior. It's dangerous, Tex warned. If he realizes what you're doing, he could retaliate. He's already done his worst to me, Maria replied. Besides, I won't be going in alone. I'll have backup and I'll have evidence to protect myself. Tex nodded slowly. All right then. If you're determined to do this, I'll help you every step of the way. But we're going to be smart about it and we're going to be careful. Over the next week, they refined their plan. Maria would approach Morrison under the guise of being desperate and homeless, appealing to his predatory instincts. She would wear a wire provided by a private investigator that Tex had hired, and she would try to get Morrison to incriminate himself on tape. Meanwhile, Tex would use his connections in the local business community to gather information about Morrison's financial dealings and property management practices. If they could build a comprehensive case against him, they might be able to ensure that justice was finally served. The plan required careful timing and considerable courage from Maria, but she was determined to see it through. Derek Morrison had made the mistake of thinking he could destroy her without consequences. Now, he was about to learn that Maria Rodriguez was stronger than he'd ever imagined. On a sweltering Thursday morning, Maria stood outside Morrison Trailer Park, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had dressed carefully for this encounter, choosing clothes that would make her look desperate and vulnerable. Her hair was uncombed. Her makeup was smudged to suggest she'd been crying, and she wore an old maternity dress that was deliberately too small, emphasizing her pregnancy. Hidden beneath her clothes was a small recording device that the private investigator had provided. Tex was parked about a quarter-mile away, ready to come to her aid if anything went wrong. Tommy was safely at the ranch with Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor who had agreed to babysit. Derek Morrison was in his office, a cramped trailer that served as the headquarters for his property management empire. Through the grimy window, Maria could see him sitting behind his desk, talking on the phone. The sight of him brought back all the anger and humiliation she'd felt during their last encounter. Taking a deep breath, Maria approached the office door and knocked tentatively. "Mr. Morrison, it's Maria Rodriguez. I need to talk to you." The door opened, and Derek Morrison stood there with a smug smile on his face. He was a short, stocky man in his 50s, with thinning hair and cold eyes that seemed to look right through people. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Look what the cat dragged in. Maria Rodriguez, isn't it? I heard you were living under a bridge somewhere." "Please, Mr. Morrison," Maria said, forcing her voice to tremble with desperation. "I need your help. I've been sleeping in my car for weeks and I'm 7 months pregnant. I'll do anything to get back into one of your units." Morrison's smile grew wider and Maria could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Anything you say. That's interesting. Come on in and let's talk about your options." The office was even more disgusting than Maria remembered. The carpet was stained and worn, the furniture was cheap and uncomfortable, and the air reeked of cigarettes and stale coffee. Morrison settled behind his desk and gestured for Maria to sit in a rickety chair across from him. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you want back into one of my properties. That's going to be difficult, considering your history of non-payment and the damage you caused to your previous unit." "I never damaged anything," Maria protested, playing her role perfectly. "And I paid my rent on time every month. You know that." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that filled the small office. "That's not what my records show. According to my files, you were 2 months behind on rent when I evicted you. Cost me a lot of money to clean up the mess you left behind." "That's not true, and you know it," Maria said, allowing real anger to creep into her voice. "You destroyed my receipt and forged the eviction notice. But I'm not here to argue about the past. I'm here because I need a place to live, and I'm willing to work something out." Morrison's eyes lit up with interest. "Work something out? What exactly are you proposing?" Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. "I know you've had arrangements with other tenants in the past, women who couldn't afford their rent but found other ways to pay. I'm desperate, Mr. Morrison. I'll do whatever it takes to keep my children safe." "Interesting," Morrison said, his voice becoming husky with excitement. "And what makes you think I'd be interested in that kind of arrangement with you?" "Because I remember the things you said to me before," Maria replied, fighting to keep the revulsion out of her voice. "About how there were other ways to pay rent. About how a woman in my situation should be grateful for any help she could get." Morrison stood up and walked around his desk, moving closer to Maria. "You know, I always thought you were too proud for your own good. Maybe being homeless for a few weeks has taught you some humility." He leaned against the edge of his desk, his eyes roaming over her pregnant form in a way that made her skin crawl. "I might be able to help you," he continued, his voice taking on a sickening tone of false generosity. "I've got a unit available, not the nicest one, but it's got running water and electricity. The rent is $800 a month, but for a woman in your situation, we could work out a different payment schedule." Maria forced herself to look grateful and desperate. "What kind of payment schedule?" Morrison's smile became even more predatory. "Well, let's say you could pay $200 in cash each month and make up the difference through personal services. Nothing too demanding, just a few hours of your time each week. I'm sure a woman like you knows how to make a man feel appreciated." The recording device hidden under her clothes was capturing every disgusting word. Maria felt sick to her stomach, but she knew she had to keep him talking to get enough evidence to destroy him. "What exactly would these personal services involve?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Morrison moved even closer, his breath hot against her face. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. A few hours a week in my private apartment, just you and me. Nothing your boyfriend needs to know about, if you know what I mean. And if I agree to this arrangement, you'll guarantee that I won't be evicted again?" Maria asked, making sure to get his promises on tape. "As long as you keep up your end of the bargain," Morrison replied. "Miss a payment or refuse to provide services, and you'll be out on the street faster than you can blink. I've got friends in the sheriff's department who don't ask too many questions when I need someone removed." Maria felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to stay in character. "Have you made this kind of arrangement with other tenants?" Morrison chuckled. "Let's just say you wouldn't be the first desperate woman to realize that sometimes you have to do what you have to do to survive. I've been helping women in difficult situations for years. Some of them are still here, still grateful for my generosity." "What about Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who was evicted last month?" Maria asked, remembering the complaints she'd read online. Morrison's expression darkened. That old bat was asking too many questions, getting other tenants riled up. Sometimes you have to make examples of people who don't appreciate what they have. "So you evicted her even though she was paying rent on time?" "I evicted her because she was a troublemaker," Morrison snapped. "Just like that Williams woman with all the kids. Some people don't know when to keep their mouths shut." Maria had heard enough. The recording device had captured Morrison admitting to sexual coercion, fraudulent evictions, and corruption involving local law enforcement. She stood up slowly, her hand moving to her belly as if she was having pregnancy-related discomfort. "Mr. Morrison, I need to think about this," she said. "This is a big decision, and I want to make sure I'm making the right choice for my children." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "You don't have time to think about it. This offer expires today. Either you agree to my terms right now, or you can go back to sleeping in your car." "I understand," Maria said, backing toward the door. "But I need to get my son from where he's staying and gather our things. Can I come back tomorrow morning with an answer?" Morrison studied her face suspiciously. "You're not getting cold feet, are you? Because if you're planning to cause trouble for me, you should know that I have ways of making life very difficult for people who cross me." "I'm not planning to cause trouble," Maria lied smoothly. "I'm just being practical. If I'm going to be living here, I need to make arrangements for my son's care during our appointments." The explanation seemed to satisfy Morrison's suspicions. "Fine. Come back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock with your answer. But don't think you can shop around for a better deal. No one else in this town is going to rent to a pregnant woman with bad credit and no references." As Maria left the office, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had the evidence she needed to destroy Derek Morrison's predatory operation. The recording device had captured his admission of sexual coercion, fraudulent business practices, and corruption. Now it was time to turn the tables on him. She walked quickly to where Tex was waiting, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. When she got into his truck, she could see the concern in his weathered face. "How did it go?" he asked, studying her expression. "Better than I hoped," Maria replied, pulling out the recording device. "He admitted to everything: the sexual coercion, the fraudulent evictions, even having corrupt contacts in law enforcement. We have enough evidence to destroy him." Tex's jaw tightened as Maria replayed portions of the recording. "That son of a—" He caught himself before finishing the curse, mindful of Maria's sensibilities. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Maria said, though she was still shaking slightly from the encounter. "Actually, I feel better than I have in months. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I feel like I have some power." Their next stop was the office of Janet Crawford, the private investigator Tex had hired. Janet was a former police detective who specialized in cases involving housing discrimination and sexual harassment. She listened to the recording with growing excitement. "This is incredible evidence," she said, her eyes shining with professional satisfaction. "We have him dead to rights on multiple felonies. Sexual coercion, housing discrimination, fraud. This recording alone could put him away for years." "What's our next step?" Tex asked. Janet pulled out a thick file folder. "I've been investigating Morrison's business practices for the past week, and what I've found is going to shock you. He's been running this scam for at least 10 years, and I've documented over 40 cases of fraudulent evictions." She spread documents across her desk, showing a pattern of abuse that was even more extensive than Maria had imagined. He targets vulnerable women, single mothers, elderly widows, immigrants who don't speak English well. He uses the same tactics every time: destroys rent receipts, forges eviction notices, and then offers to let them stay in exchange for sexual favors. How has he gotten away with it for so long? Maria asked, horrified by the scope of Morrison's crimes. Two reasons, Janet explained. First, his victims are usually too ashamed or frightened to report what happened. Second, he's been paying off Deputy Sheriff Bobby Hutchins to look the other way when complaints are filed. She pulled out a series of photographs showing Morrison handing envelopes to a man in a sheriff's uniform. "I've been conducting surveillance for the past week. These photos show Morrison making regular payments to Hutchins, probably to ensure that any complaints against him disappear." Tex studied the photographs with growing anger. So he's been bribing law enforcement to protect his operation. That's exactly what he's been doing, Janet confirmed. But now we have enough evidence to take down the entire network. The recording Maria made gives us probable cause for a full investigation, and I have contacts in the FBI who specialize in public corruption cases. Maria felt a surge of satisfaction. Derek Morrison had thought he was untouchable, but he was about to learn that his victims were stronger than he'd ever imagined. What happens next? First, we make copies of everything and store them in multiple secure locations, Janet said. Then we contact the FBI and the district attorney's office. We'll also reach out to local media outlets. A story like this will generate a lot of public interest. What about the other victims? Maria asked. The women who are still being exploited. Janet smiled grimly. Once this story breaks, they'll finally have the courage to come forward. Morrison's house of cards is about to collapse. As they left Janet's office, Maria felt a sense of justice beginning to take shape. Derek Morrison had destroyed her life, but in doing so, he had unknowingly set in motion the events that would lead to his downfall. Sometimes, she reflected, the best revenge was simply ensuring that justice was served. The next morning, Maria didn't return to Morrison's office as promised. Instead, she was sitting in the conference room of the FBI field office in Amarillo, along with Tex, Janet Crawford, and Special Agent Rebecca Torres. Agent Torres was a specialist in public corruption cases, and she had been very interested in the evidence they had gathered. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Agent Torres said, "I want to thank you for your courage in coming forward. The evidence you've provided is going to help us shut down a criminal enterprise that has been operating for far too long." "What happens now?" Maria asked. "We're going to coordinate with local law enforcement, the honest ones, to execute search warrants on Morrison's properties and financial records. We'll also be arresting Deputy Hutchins on corruption charges. Your recording gives us probable cause for a full investigation." Agent Torres paused, then continued. "I should warn you that this process might take some time. Morrison will likely try to discredit you and the other victims. Are you prepared for that?" Maria thought about Tommy, about the baby she was carrying, about all the other women who had been victimized by Morrison's predatory behavior. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "I won't let him hurt anyone else." That afternoon, as Maria was preparing lunch at the ranch, she received a phone call that made her blood run cold. Derek Morrison had somehow gotten her number, and he was furious. "You little bitch," he snarled into the phone. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you're going to regret crossing me. I have friends in this town who can make your life very difficult." Maria felt fear grip her heart, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Morrison." "Don't play dumb with me," he spat. "You didn't show up this morning like you promised. I'm starting to think you're not as desperate as you claimed to be." "I had complications with my pregnancy," Maria lied. "I had to go to the hospital for monitoring. I'm sorry I couldn't call to let you know." There was a long pause, and Maria could hear Morrison breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "You have 24 hours to get back here and accept my offer," he said finally. "After that, the deal is off the table, and I'll make sure that no one in this county will rent to you." The line went dead, and Maria sat staring at the phone, her hands shaking. Morrison's threats were terrifying, but she knew she had to stay strong. Agent Torres had warned her that he might try to intimidate her, and she had to trust that the authorities would protect her. When Tex came in for lunch, he immediately noticed her distress. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Maria told him about Morrison's call, and she could see the anger building in Tex's weathered face. "That man is getting desperate," he said. "That's actually a good sign. It means he knows his operation is falling apart." "But what if he tries to hurt us?" Maria asked, her protective instincts kicking in as she thought about Tommy. "He won't get the chance," Tex said firmly. "I've already taken some precautions. I've installed security cameras around the ranch, and I've asked some of my neighbors to keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. Plus, Agent Torres has assured me that they'll have the area under surveillance." That evening, as Maria was putting Tommy to bed, her son looked up at her with worried eyes. "Mama, are we safe here?" Maria sat down on the edge of his bed and smoothed his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe here. Mr. Tex and I are making sure that the bad man can't hurt us anymore." "Is he going to jail?" Tommy asked. "I hope so," Maria said honestly. We're working with some very good people to make sure he can't hurt other families the way he hurt us." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Good. He was mean to you, and that made me scared." Maria felt her heart break a little at her son's words. No child should have to worry about their parents' safety. "You don't have to be scared anymore," she promised. "We're going to be okay." As she tucked Tommy in and kissed him good night, Maria reflected on how much their lives had changed in just a few short weeks. They had gone from being homeless and desperate to being safe and secure, surrounded by people who cared about them. And now, they were on the verge of seeing justice served against the man who had tried to destroy them. The next morning brought news that filled Maria with satisfaction and relief. Agent Torres called to inform her that the FBI had executed search warrants on Morrison's properties and had arrested both Morrison and Deputy Hutchins. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, and both men were being held without bail. "We found evidence of over 60 fraudulent evictions," Agent Torres reported. Morrison kept detailed records of his victims, probably as a way to blackmail them into silence. He also had a safe full of cash that we believe came from his extortion activities. "What about the other women?" Maria asked. "The ones who are still being victimized?" "They're free," Agent Torres said with satisfaction in her voice. "We've already started reaching out to them, and several have agreed to testify against Morrison. Your courage in coming forward has given them the strength to speak up." Over the next few days, the story exploded across local and national media. "Pregnant woman brings down predatory landlord," read the headline in the Amarillo Globe News. Television reporters came to the ranch to interview Maria, and she found herself becoming a symbol of courage and resilience. The interviews were difficult, but Maria felt it was important to tell her story. She wanted other women in similar situations to know that they didn't have to suffer in silence, that there were people who would believe them and help them fight back. "I want people to understand that what happened to me could happen to anyone," she told one reporter. "Derek Morrison preyed on vulnerable women because he thought we were powerless. But he was wrong. We're stronger than he ever imagined." The story resonated with people across the country. Maria began receiving letters and emails from women who had faced similar situations, thanking her for her courage and sharing their own stories of survival and triumph. One letter that particularly moved her came from Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly woman who had been evicted by Morrison. "Dear Maria," she wrote, "I want you to know that your courage has given me hope. I thought I was too old and too weak to fight back, but seeing what you've accomplished has inspired me to reclaim my dignity. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to stand up for what's right." As the legal proceedings continued, Maria found herself becoming more confident and empowered. She was no longer the desperate, frightened woman who had been walking barefoot along the highway. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a voice for justice. The trial began 3 months later, and Maria was the star witness for the prosecution. She testified about Morrison's predatory behavior, his fraudulent business practices, and the fear and desperation he had caused her and her son. The jury listened with rapt attention as she described the recording session and the disgusting things Morrison had said. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her, suggesting that she was lying to get revenge against Morrison. But the recording spoke for itself, and the testimony of dozens of other victims painted a clear picture of a man who had systematically exploited vulnerable women for years. When the verdict was announced, Maria felt a sense of closure that she had never expected. Derek Morrison was found guilty on multiple charges including sexual coercion, housing discrimination, fraud, and racketeering. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and his property management empire was seized to provide restitution to his victims. Deputy Hutchins was also convicted on corruption charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The entire network of corruption that had protected Morrison's operation was dismantled, and several other officials were forced to resign in disgrace. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Maria received a call from Janet Crawford informing her that Morrison's seized assets would be distributed among his victims. Maria would receive enough money to buy a small house and establish a college fund for Tommy and her unborn child. "You did it," Janet said, her voice filled with admiration. "You brought down a predator and helped dozens of women reclaim their lives. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you accomplished." As Maria hung up the phone, she felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that she had never experienced before. She had started this journey as a victim, but she was ending it as a victor. Derek Morrison had tried to destroy her, but instead, he had unleashed a force that would ultimately destroy him. The months following the trial were filled with positive changes for Maria and her family. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl, whom she named Hope, in honor of everything they had overcome. Tommy was thriving on the ranch, developing a genuine love for horses and ranch life under Tex's patient guidance. Maria had decided to stay on at the ranch permanently, not just as an employee but as a true partner in the operation. She and Tex had developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared values, and she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The ranch was thriving as well, benefiting from Maria's organizational skills and business acumen. She had implemented new systems for managing the books, marketing their cattle, and maintaining relationships with suppliers and customers. What had once been a struggling operation was now profitable and growing. "I never thought I'd say this," Tex told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching Tommy play with the horses. "But getting old isn't as scary when you know there are good people who will carry on the work you've started." Maria smiled, bouncing baby Hope on her lap. "You're not getting old, Tex. You're just getting wiser. Wise enough to know that taking a chance on a pregnant woman and her son walking along the highway was the best decision I ever made," he replied. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had started as a victim of a predatory landlord, but she had ended up as a homeowner, a business partner, and a symbol of hope for other women facing similar struggles. The settlement money from Morrison's seized assets had allowed her to buy a small house in town, but she had chosen to stay at the ranch. This was home now, not just for her and her children, but for the extended family they had created with Tex and the community of neighbors who had supported them. Tommy had adapted to ranch life as if he'd been born to it. He was learning to ride horses, care for cattle, and understand the rhythms of rural life. Most importantly, he was growing up with a sense of security and belonging that Maria had feared he might never experience. Baby Hope was thriving as well, surrounded by love and attention from her extended ranch family. She was a happy, healthy child who seemed to embody the optimism and resilience that had carried them through their darkest days. But Maria's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that her actions had helped other women escape similar situations. The Morrison case had led to changes in local housing laws, increased oversight of property management companies, and the establishment of a legal aid clinic specifically for victims of housing discrimination. Maria had become involved with the legal aid clinic, using her experience to help other women navigate the complex process of fighting back against predatory landlords. She had discovered that she had a talent for organizing and advocacy, and she was considering going back to school to study law. "You've got a gift for helping people," Tex had told her. "Maybe it's time to think about making that your full-time career." Maria was intrigued by the possibility, but she was also content with the life she had built at the ranch. She had found peace and purpose in the simple rhythms of rural life, and she wasn't sure she wanted to give that up. As she sat on the porch that evening, watching her son play and holding her daughter close, Maria felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned that even in the darkest times, there were still good people willing to help, still opportunities for justice, and still reasons to hope. The cowboy who had picked up a pregnant woman and her son walking barefoot along a Texas highway had given them more than just a ride. He had given them a chance at a new life, an opportunity to fight back against injustice, and a home where they could build a future filled with hope and possibility. And as the stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, Maria knew that their story was far from over. They had overcome incredible challenges, but they had also discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, as a family, with the knowledge that they had already survived the worst and emerged stronger than ever before. The ranch had become more than just a place to live. It had become a symbol of second chances, of the power of human kindness, and of the truth that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can change lives forever. Maria Rodriguez had started as a victim, but she had become a survivor, a fighter, and ultimately, a victor who had turned her pain into purpose and her struggles into strength. Years later, when people asked her about that day when she and Tommy had been walking barefoot along the highway, Maria would smile and say that it was the day their real life began. It was the day they learned that even in the darkest moments, there are still angels watching over us, still good people willing to help, and still hope for a better tomorrow. The pregnant woman who had been walking barefoot for miles had found her cowboy, and together they had built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. Their story had become a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the truth that sometimes the most broken people can become the strongest fighters for justice. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all, that no matter how dark the night might seem, dawn always comes, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning, a fresh start, and a chance to build something better from the pieces of what came before.